Adam Shoalts. Cheers for scaring the living daylights out of me.
Well, thank you for having me back on the show.
I'm not going into the woods for a few days. I was going to do a nice fall trip, but I read your book and nope. It's kind of a Blair Witch thing going on. All right. Well, you've been busy and you have a new book out. And first of all, what's it all about? But also, did you time this to have this thing out before Halloween? I think you did.
Okay, well, I'll answer your second question first. No, I didn't time it. And in fact, if you look at all my books, all four of them have come out on the same date. They always come out in the first week of October. So that's just coincidence. That's just the way my books are scheduled. So they always are first week of October books. So purely coincidence in terms of the scheduling. But since you mentioned it, it is a good book if you like the spooky season, Halloween, and all of that, because there's definitely some thematic similarities. In the book itself, it's called The Whisper on the Night Wind, The True History of a Wilderness Legend. And it is the story of a legend from a place you won't find on many maps called Traverspine, which was an old fur trade post in the heart of Labrador at the foot of the Mealy Mountains, which was abandoned. And a century ago, it was the scene of an extraordinary haunting by large creatures that no one seemed able to identify. Strange tracks were found in the woods. Unearthly calls were heard in the night. And most alarmingly of all, sled dogs went missing with no explanation. And, the most seasoned trappers of the day, they examined these tracks and they couldn't make heads or tails of them. So all of this really hooked me, and I found it a fascinating story. And maybe what was most fascinating of all about it were the detailed eyewitness accounts by no less than 3 medical doctors of the day, as well as a wildlife biologist. So I was almost compelled, I felt, to pack up my backpack and load up my canoe and set off for the heart of Labrador to try to find the ruins of Traverspine and investigate this old mystery and see if I could solve what had baffled all of them back 100 years ago at the place.
Well, what was the first reading you read to get you interested in this? Is it Merrick? No. Is it Merrick? Yeah.
Yes. So I'd actually come across the account of Elliot Merrick, who was a fur trapper, an American fur trapper in Labrador, quite a few years ago. And I'd read his account alone in my office here. And I was accustomed by that point to many a campfire story, and I always took them with a grain of salt. Sasquatch stories, Windigo stories, ghost stories, this sort of thing. And I enjoy an old ghost story as much as the next person, but I never took them very seriously. And I certainly never thought that I would set off on an expedition to investigate one. But there was something about Merrick's story that sent a chill down my spine. It seems somehow more tangible than any other Sasquatch or similar story I'd ever encountered. There seemed to be something real there, something more material to this story. But at the time I thought, well, how could you ever investigate something that elusive? And I put it out of my mind until sometime later, I came across a second account by a different author made independently, also about a century ago, of the same frightening circumstances in Labrador. And this really fired me up at that point, because I was like, okay, now I have to dig a little deeper, because if I can find multiple accounts written by different people independently of each other, many of them not published at the time, there's something here. And now my curiosity is up and I need to find out more. So that's how it all began.
Well, explain the sightings, like the whole idea of what they saw and also what they heard, and also the prints that were left behind. Why is it so haunting?
Well, it was very creepy. I think most people are probably familiar in some way with Sasquatch or Bigfoot sightings and folklore from mostly Western North America. But this is quite different. It's Labrador, and we don't normally associate these kind of things with Labrador. It's more of a West Coast phenomenon. And Labrador in itself is just this amazing wilderness. Almost that rounds to 0.09 or so people per square kilometer. So the fact that it came from Labrador, I found intriguing, because with the West Coast, it's like, well, there's a certain folklore that's ingrained there. That's part of the culture, where this is something quite different. And the sightings themselves were a bit alarming. They described a large 7-foot tall bipedal creature, walked on 2 legs, and it had a white stripe or white blaze across its forehead, big grinning teeth, and most bizarrely of all, it was said that it left cloven hoofed tracks which really seemed odd. And because of that, many of the chroniclers described it as a demon or the devil itself. So this whole supernatural element to the sightings gave it another dimension, and I found the whole thing just utterly intriguing, and I had to know more.
Now, when you went to the publisher, I don't know if you went to the publisher before the trip or after the trip, but did they sort of say, yeah, Adam, can you just go on another canoe trip and write about that? This is kind of out of there. Like, this is completely different than what you've done. Or did they say, hey, this is cool?
Oh, no, they were very enthusiastic right from the start. As soon as I told them the idea for the book, they were on board. And in fact, all of my books, even though they're on different subject matter, a careful reader might have picked up over the years that I am actually have a long-standing interest in legends and lore. Almost all my books, in somehow there's a reference to a Sasquatch or a Windigo. Always written from more of a skeptical perspective, but I love that color of the wilderness, the folklore and the legends. So that comes up in all of my books, even in History Canon 10 Maps, which is a conventional history book with footnotes and all the rest. I get into mammoths and Windigos quite a bit in that book even. So this was something I'd always been interested in, but I never necessarily thought I would write a book on. But maybe because I'd already written 3 books, I felt I had a little more latitude to pitch this idea to my publisher. And luckily for me, they were enthusiastic about it. So I took my best stab at it, and it's brand new. It's been out for less than a week. So I don't know what kind of reception it's going to get, but I actually think that this is the best book I've ever written. So I hope that people will enjoy it, because it is intended to give people a good story that might make them more excited to throw on their backpack or jump in their canoe and get out and explore.
Yeah, I'll throw it right at you. I do not think it's one of those books where, I actually wouldn't think of this for your writing, but it would be, Adam is writing about some creature in the wilderness because, because he's going down. Like he's got to do a Sasquatch story because he's going downward. That wasn't it. It actually really showed your ability to write and to tell a story with historical facts and folklore intermixed like a tossed salad. And I think I was telling you too that it was almost like going back to when I was a kid watching Sunday adventure movies with my dad, after church, and it was like Tarzan or The Creature from the Black Lagoon, but with a lot of historical background and everything else. So it was a page turner for sure. And yeah, it was made you think. And it's a whiskey fireside chat, by the way. So I know you're having your tea. And I do know, because I read the book, that your favorite tea is green tea.
When I'm at home, yep.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm drinking this, and I've never had it before, but it was on sale. So, all right. Your partner, Zach, why not do this alone? Were you afraid to go out by yourself?
Well, I figured I'm mostly known for doing solo expeditions, but I do expeditions with other people as well. So certain expeditions I do, I usually want a partner, especially if it's more of a historical expedition where a second pair of eyes would be valuable. Like if I'm looking for a lost explorer, or there's some sort of archaeological component, or we're looking for the ruins of a place, I think, 2 heads are better than one. So having another person out there, he might see something that I miss, or we might be able to cover more grounds, and we can put our heads together and come up with explanations and theories. So we'll be more effective. So for these kind of expeditions, which are a little bit different than some of the other ones I've done, I think a partner is definitely a valuable asset. So I wanted one right from the start. I'd never intended to do this solo. I always wanted someone to come with me. And my list of people was pretty short, and Zach came to the top of it. So that's why he ended up there.
And also last minute, like you only gave him 4 days, said, hey, I remember you from high school. I don't know what you're up to right now. You're a prize fighter and insurance salesman. And do you want to go on this trip? And I was reading this, I go, he's not going to go. No. And so he went. Now, did you choose him because he was a prize fighter and could fight the demon, or basically because he can go in 4 days?
Yeah, it was extremely short notice. He had less than a week to decide because it was late in the year. We were almost into September already, and I was determined to get up to Labrador before winter came. So he had very short notice. But I knew enough about him that I thought he had the right personality, that he would jump at it at the drop of a hat and go. And as you alluded to, he had a pretty interesting background. He's still currently a professional mixed martial arts fighter. And I knew he'd run marathons and triathlon races, and that he was, an outdoorsy guy who liked fishing and canoeing and all these things. I didn't know him super well. I'd never been camping with him before. He was a year older than me in high school. But that's basically normally when I'm coming up with an expedition partner, I just sort of look at my old high school yearbook. And I remember, I'm just sort of in that moment, I was like, Zach, he would be perfect. So I got in touch with him, and right off the bat, took him like 20 minutes to respond and said, I think I'm in. And then, within the hour, he confirmed. And just like that, we were ready to go. So that's how it all began.
And then you headed out, and what I loved about it, you had 3 days. I think it was 3 days it took for you to drive to Labrador from where you live in Ontario. And I guess you got to know each other, but you went back and forth of what this thing could be. And what I really thought was fascinating, what I loved about the book, is that you were like, there's no way it's the devil. Okay, there's no way it's this gorilla creature that people are making up, whatever. It's like, it's got to be something. And one, I think was Zach actually thought about, or maybe you did and Zach agreed, was that it could be a polar bear with mange. So explain that one.
Yeah, so we were both skeptical but open-minded. So I asked Zach right from the outset. I mean, as you alluded to, we had a 3-day drive to get acquainted, to drive to Labrador, because we left from Southern Ontario, Norfolk County, and we drove over 2,000 kilometers. And I asked him, do you believe in Sasquatch? Do you believe in ghosts? Do you believe in demons? Like, we went through the list, and his answers were very similar to mine, which was generally no, but I'm open-minded. I believe in evidence. But we both felt, well, there has to be some sort of rational explanation. We didn't think that this was a hoax or purely made up, but nor did we believe that there was an actual demon creature haunting the woods of Labrador. And we tried to come up with different hypotheses to explain it. And it was actually Zach, as you said, who one of our first theories that we were working on is that it was a polar bear that had come inland from the coast of Labrador into the spruce forest of the interior. But maybe the reason it wasn't recognized is because it had mange, and mange would cause the hair to fall out. And in recent years, mange outbreaks among black bears especially has become quite common in the eastern United States and Pennsylvania and places like that. So we've both seen photographs of black bears with mange, and they look almost unrecognizable when they have mange. I mean, they're just a small fraction of their normal size because they're emaciated, and they, with their loose folds of skin and no hair, you barely recognize the thing. It looks more like a sort of giant chimpanzee. And I had seen a photograph of a polar bear that had mange, so I knew that it was theoretically possible that they could get mange as well. And polar bears, maybe not a lot of people know this, but underneath their white fur, they have a black skin. So they would look even more like the description of the creature in the historical accounts. So that was a theory we were working on initially, as we were paddling along the coast of Labrador and thinking these things over in our heads as we were camping and exploring the wilderness there.
But you also thought other things, like you go in great detail about other things around the world where it was either folklore or a real thing that happened, where it was two species that bred together to form some other creature, or a creature that was never seen, even from the Ice Age, was never seen because of the vast wilderness area, to even Windigo. All right. So what about a tangible species that these people 100 years ago, and this was a very remote village, like in the middle of nowhere, and they really didn't see anything. In fact, you even said the only book they would probably read is the Bible, right? So the idea is actually they thought, you thought it might be some other creature. So list some of those creatures that it could have been.
We cover every possible scenario we could think of, and we get into depth about, could it have been a hoax, and what are some of the factors in favor of that? What are some of the factors against it being a hoax? One of the theories I proposed is, well, Merrick in particular described it as a gorilla. No one else really used that term, but he did. And one of the other doctors, Patton, thought maybe something ape-like. So I thought, well, what if there was a shipwreck on the coast of Labrador and a gorilla or a chimpanzee had escaped? So there actually was one. That would make sense. But then we realized, well, these sightings continued over at least 2 winters, and there's no way a chimpanzee or a gorilla could have survived the brutally cold Labrador winter when it's a bone-chilling -40. So that ruled out that theory. One of the accounts, actually the earliest one, made by a guy named Robinson, a British explorer in 1909, he actually thought it's real. It's just some animal that's never been classified by science before. And he thought, well, 10,000 years ago, there were all sorts of strange animals that roamed across northern Canada, like mastodons and mammoths and saber-toothed tigers and giant ground sloths. And as he put it, there's no absolute reason why they all had to die off, and if some should still survive, we're better than Labrador. So we looked at extinct megafauna, and could something like that have survived? And we eventually say no, that's not credible, because although one could survive, you would need at least a breeding plausible that nobody would have documented that at some point in the last any number of centuries. And we do talk about how, in other places around the world, from South America to Africa, the world certainly remains a more mysterious place than many people realize, with large animal species still being discovered by science, which is to say they're not in any existing textbook or zoology book. That sort of thing still does happen in the 21st century, even in relatively heavily populated places like Tanzania or Madagascar, but also down in the Andes. So we look at that as well, but we weigh all the different factors, and ultimately we lean away from anything like that. And we look at folklore, legends of werewolves and things. And from a skeptical or rational perspective, these theories surely didn't just come out of thin air. They must have had their basis in something. And we apply sort of those templates and models to our case study in Labrador to try to unravel it and decipher it. But I don't want to give away all the details because you have to read the book.
The eyewitnesses, though, they weren't just some trapper that had gone squirrely, right? They were actually tangible people.
Yes, I mean, that's a question I posed several times in the book. Like, did the isolation go to their heads? I mean, 100 years ago, it must have seemed like they were at the edge of the known world. I mean, the nearest post office was 30 kilometers away. There was no phones, there was no radio. It was a life of profound isolation that we can barely imagine in our world of Zoom talks and social media and smartphones and satellite communications. And we know certainly from the historical record in Canada, there are many examples of people getting cabin fever or getting bush because the isolation became too much to bear, especially in the winter. So I consider these sort of factors, but that doesn't really seem to have been the case here at Traverspine in Labrador, because the eyewitness accounts, well, they sort of dispel that notion. They were made by people who seemed to know what they were talking about, and they were made over a number of years, and they were quite detailed, not like the sort of thing that was a fever dream. So yeah, I ultimately ruled that out as well, that it was purely just some sort of figment of their imaginations. I think that there was something very real in the woods there a century ago, which they hadn't encountered before.
And it was also cited to be on its forelegs and also hind legs, and then that one woman that shot at it and she thought she got a hit. And when asked, was it a bear, a black bear? And she, I think, lived with a trapper, but she said, no, I skinned like 12 bears. I know what a bear looks like. This was not a bear. Well, that really got me interested. And then they actually did a trace of the print. It would be cool to find that trace. They actually sketched out the print. And what you're saying in the book is, I don't want to give that much away, whatever, but it was really cool that it was like a bear print with large claws, but also had a hoof in it, which goes to be like, wasn't Jacques Cartier, didn't he in 1500 say that actually that area was a land that God gave Cain?
Yes, that's one of Jacques Cartier's famous lines from his diary. When he's off the coast of Labrador in 1534, he famously described it as the land that God gave to Cain, because coming from southern France as he did, it looked like this inconceivably desolate and bleak place, fog-bound shores and a rocky coast, and it did not at all look hospitable in the eyes of Jacques Cartier. And I think that's partly why I find Labrador so fascinating, is it has this very deep and rich tradition across many different cultures, not just the French explorers, but indigenous cultures as well as European ones, of there's something special about Labrador. I mean, I use the expression several times in the book, these spellbound mountains. It's this land of legends and lore. Perhaps more so than almost any other place in North America, Labrador, for a place that's so sparsely populated, seems to breed ghost stories and legends. And I've tried to work a lot of that folklore into the book, because to me, it gives a lot of color to the land and to the wilderness there, these rich traditions that go back centuries.
Well, you think about it too. So the idea, oh, great, Adam's got a new book out. Oh, he's going on a canoe trip. I love canoeing. This is fantastic. He's going with, did I say Zach or Adam? Oh, sorry. Oh,
I think you got it right.
Did I? Okay. So yeah, the idea of you and Zach are going on this canoe trip in Labrador. This is exciting. You're going upriver, not having a good time. Your clothes are being torn to shreds because of it's real bush, right? And then you decide, hey, let's go. And oh yeah, sorry to back up. You get to the ghost town, and then you camp there. Like, what were you thinking? Have you not seen horror movies? Again, don't go in
Yes,
there.
actually, I apparently had not seen enough horror movies, because I remember my friend Zach, when we were camping amid the ruins of Traverspine, he said, "This reminds me of Camp Crystal Lake." And I thought, what is that, a summer camp you went to as a kid? And he said, no, it's the camp from the Friday the 13th movies. So I'm trying to get caught up to speed on a lot of these references to horror movies. But yeah, it was a little bit unnerving to sleep in the shadows of abandoned buildings. It was different than what I'm used to, because I've slept in the most remote parts of Canada's wilderness, hundreds of miles from the nearest inhabited place. And I usually find that actually quite relaxing. I love being out in the wilderness, the solitude. But being in an abandoned place, like an old ghost town, is a different feeling entirely. It has its own unique atmosphere. And that was a little bit unnerving as the sun went down and we crawled inside our tents. There was definitely something uneasy about being there in that setting.
This is the same village 100 years ago when every single night they would bar the doors. They would sleep with their guns and their knives and their hatchets. They would make sure that the kids were pulled in from playing around the woods because children were stalked by this creature. And hey, let's sleep there, Zach. Sounds like a good idea.
Ruh-roh.
Yep. Well, we figured we can't travel that far and not sleep there. So we did put our tents up, and we did sleep there. Inside my tent at night, I would normally have my flashlight and I'd be reading over the eyewitness accounts and the historical sources that I'd collected on Labrador and taking notes in my journal, because during the day we'd be too busy to do that kind of stuff. So that was definitely food for thought as I would drift off in my sleeping bag after having just read these accounts of demon creatures and haunting the woods in the very spot where we were now sleeping. But I figured, oh, it's been 100 years. I'm sure in 100 years, if such a thing did exist, it's probably not still here. Maybe it went somewhere else. So upon that logic, we would actually go further into the wilderness later on our journey.
Well, because I'm thinking, okay, so that's a good idea. Let's all read the journals of all the people that saw this creature during the night while you're camping there with a flashlight. That's a really good idea. Yeah. And then you decide, well, let's just go into the interior even more and then peer into caves to see if anything's living in there. And these mountains, that was where it really got spooky. I don't think you were spooked that much in the town, but I think it really freaked you and Zach out when you went up in mountains. Maybe because you didn't drink enough water, but
yeah, well, getting to the mountains was quite difficult because we canoed along the coast of Lake Melville, which is an inland arm of the North Atlantic, and then from there we went up the Kennebec River against the current, and it was a very strong current. So we spent most of the time in the water, dragging the canoe up rapids and around rocks and things. And then when finally we could go no further because the current was just too strong, we abandoned the canoe, made a base camp, and then we continued on foot through almost impenetrable forest and alder swamps and muskeg to get to the foot of the Mealy Mountains. And from there, the plan was to climb up to the highest peak we could reach. And the bushwhacking there was more difficult than anything I've encountered anywhere else in the world. It was just so thick. I mean, I have photos in the book, color photos, and you can see in one, Zach is like 5 feet behind me, but he's just a little blur in between alder bushes because things are so thick. We could seldom see more than 2 or 3 feet in any direction. And I've never encountered so much deadfall, just balsam fir and black spruce toppled over every which way. And those dead trees with their branches snapped off have little sharp protruding branches all underneath you. And of course, with the alders and the ferns, you can't see what's down there. So we were constantly banging our shins and ripping our pants to shreds. It honestly felt like hiking 1 kilometer there was like 20 kilometers on normal terrain. And we were pretty dehydrated by the time we finally got into the mountains, into this valley. And I don't know if it was that, but we kept looking around like, hey, did you hear something? Or where'd my bug net go? Or where did your knife go? So it was definitely, there was an atmosphere in there that was unique. It wasn't like anything I'd ever encountered on any of my other journeys.
do you think then at that point that maybe back in the day when this happened, that people were kind of bush because they were living in that landscape, and some trickster in town thought, hey, wouldn't this be funny if I dressed up as the gorilla of Labrador and scared everybody? Do you think that happened?
Well, we consider the possibility that, was it some elaborate hoax or prank? And because I've done a lot of research on this sort of stuff elsewhere, as part of my PhD at McMaster, I do know of a few historical hoaxes like that happened in Canada in the fur trade, in Hudson Bay Company and that sort of thing. But this really didn't match any of those, because normally if it's a hoax, it's a one-time incident. It's not something that happens over a period of many years in very isolated places and bone-chilling minus 40-degree temperatures. And I mean, in such an isolated place as that, where people were really just limited to the necessities of life, trying to survive and, make an existence in the wilderness, it's not like you could simply order up a gorilla suit to prank a neighbor. And then, of course, if you did, that would be like taking your life in your hands, because everyone at that time in Labrador is armed and well able to use their arms. So you would probably be shot for sure. And as you alluded to, Mrs. Michelin, one of the trappers there, she actually did open fire on the creature, and she thought she had wounded it. So I don't think that a prankster would have gone to all those lengths. And then, of course, the sightings were spread out over such a large area. But at the end of the day, the final nail in the coffin for that theory, what really convinced me it could not be a hoax, was the presence of the sled dogs, because every trapping family in Labrador had at least a dozen huskies for their dog sled teams. And those huskies were like half wolves, and they had an incredibly keen sense of smell. So there's no way, a prankster might be able to fool one or two trappers, but I don't think they could fool a pack of sled dogs, because the sled dogs would surely be able to detect the human scent beneath the costume. And all the accounts, they have differences and they diverge at certain points, but they all agreed about the dogs cowering in fear, and several of them being driven right down into the river in absolute terror. So whatever it was, it must have been real enough to at least frighten the dogs. And for that reason, among all the others, we ruled out that this could be a hoax. We thought, no, there really was something that emerged from the forest there to terrify this little fur trade post and its inhabitants.
Well, that's where I started thinking, and you wrote about that a lot, about Windigo. And did they know about Windigo in that region? I know there's certain First Nations people that believe in Windigo all across North America. There's certain different stories of Ojibwe, Cree, whatever. But in Labrador, was that a thing?
Yeah, so we get into a little bit of the Windigo legends in the book, and Windigo stories are certainly part of Labrador's history. So that is within the historical region of the Windigo lore. I mean, that's pretty much everywhere from Labrador to the Rocky Mountains within the boreal forest. And there are historical accounts of Windigos in Labrador, but that was never the case that any of the people at Traverspine, or any of the people who made accounts of what had happened at Traverspine, none of them ever alluded to this possibly being a Windigo or drew even any comparisons to a Windigo. So Labrador had its own unique folk monsters, and they all seemed to sort of lean towards things that were different than a Windigo. In particular, what was sort of different about this account is that most of them kind of didn't link it to a Windigo at all. They were linking it more to Judeo-Christian beliefs that this was a devil because of the cloven hoofs, which harkens to the popular image of the devil with the lower half of a goat. So they were mostly leaning in that direction, that this was a demon or devil that was haunting the forest here. But I do see certain overlaps with some of the Windigo stories that you can find in all sorts of historical accounts from Canada. And I compare them, but ultimately I say, it doesn't really line up, but it's still an interesting comparison. And sometimes even when things don't line up, just by putting them side by side, you can shed more light on what it is you're trying to unravel. So we did do those sorts of things.
Well, explain to some people that don't know anything about Windigo. What the idea is, that is an evil spirit, or?
Well, the Windigo is shrouded in mystery, and there is no sort of canon that will explain to you exactly what a Windigo is. And there are many different traditions, but essentially it's an evil spirit within the Algonquian-speaking people's worldview. And that's the biggest language group, the biggest indigenous language group in Canada. So it encompasses many smaller nations within that language family. And no two traditions are exactly alike, but there are certain commonalities across all of them. And some indigenous elders would tell you that the Windigo is an evil spirit. And that evil spirit, historically, especially in times of famine, maybe in a hard winter, could take possession of a vulnerable human being. And slowly they would take over that person and turn them into a cannibal. And there are hundreds of accounts of this made in Canada's early history in the fur trade. Everyone from David Thompson to Alexander Mackenzie made accounts of this phenomenon. But some Indigenous elders would say, well, yes, there was a Windigo that was an evil spirit, but there was also actual Windigos that were like giant monsters that stalked the deepest depths of the forest, and they had a physical presence of their own. And some say that they always existed, that they'd been there since the dawn of time. Others say that that is actually the final degenerative form of a human, that once a human tastes human flesh, it loses its humanity and becomes a monster. And that you sort of like a werewolf or a vampire, that gradually over the centuries, you would lose more and more of your human traits and become unrecognizable and transform into this, 10-foot tall monster that lurked the forest. So that is sort of the Windigo mythology. And it's well attested in the historical record. It was a widespread belief, just like the belief in Eastern Europe in vampires is attested across many centuries of history, or werewolves in Germany and France. And I talk a little bit about some of these beliefs and legends and some of the historical cases of the Windigo in The Whisper on the Night Wind. But ultimately, this is something quite different from a Windigo story.
Wow. Okay. Well, I got to keep the script. I always write a script for this. I say the script like, all right. The detail of some mysteries. We already did that. Oh yeah. There's a scene where your partner, canoe partner, breaks your canoe paddle. It's the same canoe paddle that you used to go across the Arctic for 4 months, and you're like, oh well. But then he kept it as a stake to stab the creature. So you really did, at one point, you really did think in your mind, subconsciously, whatever, that there was something out there.
Well, I mean, there's at least bears, so it's not like we're losing or throwing all caution to the wind. We know that there's bears around. So I did have a can of bear spray, and my friend Zach, as you said, he snapped my canoe paddle when we were paddling really hard up a rapid, and he did another big stroke with it, and it hit the bottom of the river, and it just snapped right at the bend in the blade. It was a bent shaft paddle, and I should say I wasn't entirely heartbroken, because I did have 2 paddles on my journey alone across the Arctic, right? The spare paddle and the other paddle. So he only broke one of them. I still have the other one sitting in my basement here. And, not to let a paddle go to waste, he kept the broken paddle throughout the journey, and he simply converted it to a walking stick by day and a vampire stake at night. And he slept with it inside his tent because it was pretty sharp where it had snapped off. And yeah, why not keep that beside you? He didn't have a can of bear spray, so, he could say that he had no fear of anything supernatural. He was just merely keeping it there as a precaution. So he did use that throughout the journey, and he still has it now.
If I was dealing with an evil spirit in the wilderness, I'd rather have the stake, not bear spray. Like, I just found it funny too, where if it was some other creature that you were talking about, like a bear with mange and stuff like that bear would be dead by now. It was 100 years ago. If it was an evil spirit, hey, like, I don't know what you're thinking. It'd still be alive.
Could very well be. They could live for thousands of years for all we know. So,
all right. So the element was, I really thought about this book because I've read a lot of your stuff, and I know that you're really connected about protecting the natural resources or the natural world and stuff like that. I go, yeah, he's writing about a thing. When I read this, I go, I don't want to go in the woods right now. I'm terrified. It was like, I remember watching Blair Witch and not wanting to go camping right afterwards. I did, but I was terrified the entire time. And I'm okay now. But yeah, you're putting this out. It's Halloween. People are going to read this. Did you actually do it for a storyline to spook people about how vast our wilderness is and how some creature could be out there? Or did you do it to get people more enticed about the mystery of how vast the wilderness is, but it's being depleted to the point that no creature could really exist out there, the one that they saw 100 years ago?
Yeah, that's a good question. All my books have the same message at the heart of them. And not just my books, everything I've ever written, everything I've ever done in the public eye has been about wilderness preservation. Every article I've ever written, newspaper story, all my books, that's the message at the heart of them. Even my history book is really about that, especially if you see the afterword in the book. I talk about how much Canada has changed and all the things we've lost, like American chestnuts and Labrador ducks, which no longer exist. In The Whisper on the Night Wind is no different, but I'm always trying to think, what's a different angle on this message? Because we can't all be David Suzuki, right? I mean, David Suzuki is doing great work and I applaud him for it, but I try to think, well, how do you reach people who maybe don't care about saving the wilderness? What's the value of it? And The Whisper on the Night Wind, in the end, I have an afterword where I reflect on the value of wilderness. And I suggest, well, it's something that's our collective human heritage. No matter where you come from in the world, this is the reality of the vast majority of human history, right? For hundreds of thousands of years. And it's obviously shaped, it's gone deep into our psyche, how we perceive the world around us. And it's always given us this sense of mystery. And sure, a lot of that historically could be quite frightening. It took the forms of scary things that might lurk beyond the firelight, beyond the glow of the campfire, whether it's a Windigo, or Traverspine gorilla, or a Blair Witch. But I suggest, what would happen if there are no more deep, dark forests, no more wild or inaccessible mountains? We've paved them all over. We've mined them all, or we've clear cut the last forest, or what remains is just so parceled up with resorts and campgrounds and highways that it no longer really retains any resemblance to the wild thing it once was. And I suggest that, really, I think that there's something that speaks deep to our collective psyches and even our souls, if you will, about the value of wild places. It's I use the expression poetic hunting grounds for the imagination. And we have to believe that anything is possible in these places. And I think for that reason, there are many other reasons people can make. They can make economic reasons, they can make social reasons, why we should save wilderness. But I think for this, almost a spiritual reason, is compelling in its own right, why we should save wild places, truly vast wild places. You don't get it just from a park or a little conservation area. You need these immense areas that cover many millions of acres of wild land. And I think that it does us, all of us, good, even if we never set foot there. Just to know that they're still out there somewhere in our world, I think it's a thing that will enrich all of our lives and our cultures. So that is the message at the very end of the book. That I hope people will take away from it. But I hope they also will just enjoy the read and have a good spooky time.
And by the way, yes, the very end, well, before that part, oh.
Yeah, there is a bit of a twist there at the end.
Oh, it's a twist. Knew there's going to be a twist. I knew you were not going to end it just like, whatever, I don't know, we had a good trip. But no. All right. Well, cheers, my friend. And fantastic book, fantastic trip. And are you going on tour with this? Are you going to do speaking tours or signing tours and stuff?
I'm doing as much as I can within the COVID restrictions. So not as much as I did for my other books, but I am doing some speaking engagements in Ontario, in Hamilton, Waterloo, Sudbury, Ottawa, Port Hope, Owen Sound, and a few other places. I have them on my website under events, and I'll share them on my Facebook and my Instagram. And for the people who can't see me in person, who are interested and they want to see more of the story, I am doing a few virtual events as well. So yes, I am doing a bit.
Yeah, and this book is everywhere. So if everybody's wondering where do I get it, Amazon, obviously, whatever. But I was at Chapters on Saturday, and Peter Mansford's book was there, and then yours was there. You were the second down. It was like 3 rows of your book, and they already called it a bestseller. CBC was saying it's the must read of the year, and yeah, it's only been out for a week, so it's out there for sure everywhere. And what's really cool is my daughter, 7-year-old daughter, was with me. She was picking up Frankenstein for Halloween. She's going to read Frankenstein, which I found out like right behind you. You got Frankenstein. Yeah, it's a great book. And I'm looking at your book, and I went, "Hey, I'm interviewing him in a couple of days." She goes, "Yeah, whatever, Dad, you're lying." So cheers to that. I'm not lying. What's next?
What's next? I'm going to be doing a winter expedition in December, solo, out in the wild. No particular objective. This is just more me getting out into the wild and enjoying the solitude. I know you like your solitude for winter snowshoe trips as well, Kevin.
Well, not now,
so
because
doing something like that.
Windigo is really going to be out in the winter more than the summer, so I don't think I'll do winter camping this year at all.
Well, it might make the trip more interesting though if you think about those things or you read them around the campfire like I like to do. But and then in the spring, I'm potentially considering another very long solo journey. Could be up to 4 months, but we'll wait and see how the winter goes and how I feel come ice melt in the spring.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, thanks a lot for the chat and the book, and really, it's a great read. Just so you know, I read this in 4 days. If you know me, it takes me probably 2 weeks to read a book. So yes, and I remember it all. So there. And what else? What else? What else? I don't know. What's your favorite spooky story for Halloween? Like, what's your best novel for Halloween to read?
Whisper on the Night Wind. It's perfect for Halloween. No, well, I do like Halloween and I do like Gothic literature. So, for short stories or novels, are we talking here? Fiction or nonfiction?
Well, how about this? If a novel, is it Frankenstein or is it Dracula?
Okay, those are two classics. I love them both. I've read them both. But I would say for the reread value, I would give the nod to Bram Stoker's Dracula. I've read that book several times. The first 7 chapters or so are the best. When Jonathan Harker goes to the Carpathian Mountains and he's Dracula's guest. That is surely one of the all-time greats as far as Gothic literature goes. So I would give the nod to them, although I do like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein as well. But yeah, I would give a slight nod to Dracula if those are my only 2 choices.
That's great. All right. Happy Halloween, sir.
Straight back at you. Happy Halloween, Kevin.